So here's a video for chapter 14. And this is the water chapter, and there are some topics that we didn't get to cover in class, and you need to know them for the test. So here they are. So essentially this kind of movie is going to cover problems with water use, okay? And so this falls into three different categories. Using when there is too much water, when there's too little water, and when the water quality is very poor or it's contaminated. In this last part of the poor water quality and contamination is actually covered in chapter 22 when we talk about water pollution. So we'll be talking about circumstances when there's too much water, like flooding, or there's too little water, like drought. Okay, so first, with too much water, flooding occurs obviously both naturally and it's also human induced, and you'll see what I mean by that, but it's basically the way that we have manipulated our land makes certain areas more prone to flooding. And modern floods, as you guys have probably heard a lot in the news, just there's always some sort of flooding that happens somewhere during the course of a year. And they're very destructive now more than they have been in the past because of the way we've manipulated our landscape. We've removed a lot of plants and soil areas where water is absorbed. And we also construct a lot of buildings on floodplains. So there's some areas of the world that are supposed to flood. It's just part of the ecosystem, and it's how certain areas like a vast plain would get water in a short amount of time. And if you build there, then you're putting yourself at risk of a flood. And then a floodplain is essentially this area that borders a river channel that has the potential to flood. So this kind of like around the Mississippi and stuff like that. So the ways of dealing with that have traditionally been to build levees, which are these kind of barriers on the side of a river. So you can see here's a floodplain on the side of a river, and then if you build a levee, that will hopefully help to prevent the river from kind of spilling over onto the floodplain. And this can cause problems like what happened in New Orleans with all the flooding there. And so levees are not foolproof by any means, and it's kind of a suggested way of doing it, as you can see here. A little bit more productive way is to have the levee set back from the river. So here you have a channelized river that's kind of been its course has been manipulated and straightened, and it flows more strongly in that case. And if you keep the natural river that kind of meanders and give it more space, then you're allowing it to kind of go up and down in terms of its water level without risking the houses on the side. You lose land, and so that's why it's not done as much. Here you have more land to settle on, but it's more at risk for flooding. And then this is just a diagram to show you the comparison between urban and pre-urban floodplains. So basically, if you compare these two things, this is a natural setting. You have the trees, and here you have an urban setting. And there's a huge difference with what happens to water in these two landscapes. In a pre-urban area with, has trees and bushes or whatever, it's just kind of a natural area, all of this ground is permeable to water. And the water, when it falls, a lot of it is going to go to recharge the groundwater, 50%, as you can see here. Obviously that would vary with different types of landscapes. Some of it would run off the surface, and some would be evaporated or transpired. If you remember, that's the kind of the water loss through leaves of a plant back into the atmosphere. Okay, so you have a lot going back into the atmosphere, which is good because eventually it'll fall back down as rain. And you have a lot that is stored underground too, because a lot of it's soaking into the soil. Well, what's happened now in a lot of places is we have, paved it, whether it's driveways or roads or roofs or just houses in general. So we have a lot less soil, which means a lot less water can soak into the ground. So you see the water reduction in terms of its recharging groundwater goes down. And then you also have
How's your video going?
So surface runoff goes from 10% all the way to 43%, which is huge. And we'll talk a lot about the implications of this in chapter 22. So surface runoff basically is when all that water flows down the street into the gutters that you see all the time, like when it rains. And you can also see that the evaporation and transpiration is greatly reduced from 40 to 25%. And mostly because you don't have plants that are breathing out all that water. So this leads to a drying out of this area, which isn't good either. Okay, so now we're going to when there's too little water, and this is typically found in arid lands, which means they're kind of dry. And of course, drought is a problem with that, which means kind of a lack of water from the sky, obviously. But overdrawing water is also a problem, and this is when you overdraw for irrigation. Excuse me. So overdrawing water for irrigation purposes, as you can see in this picture, and that's essentially taking out too much groundwater, and it depletes the aquifer. And this can lead to something called subsidence and also sinkholes. So, and I'll show you a picture of those two things in a couple of slides. So here is a map of Canada and the United States and Mexico. And you have many areas that have a severe water shortages, like in the western United States, except for over here, of course. That's really wet, wetter than anywhere else in the United States. But you can see, obviously, that some areas are going to be much more prone to drought. And also aquifer depletion. So here is the degree to which certain aquifers have been depleted. You can see California, we've got a lot of depletion there of all the agriculture. And also, well, here too, but especially in the middle of the country, there's something called an Ogallala aquifer, and this is this humongous aquifer. It's actually the world's largest aquifer, and it provides 30% of all groundwater that's used for irrigating farms in the United States. And it's being depleted pretty quickly. And it's pretty neat because it holds, as I've mentioned in class a couple of times, it has this fossil water that has basically kind of melted from glaciers. And it makes it difficult to recharge this aquifer because a lot of it is confined. And as you remember from class, hopefully, that means that rain that falls is not going to automatically recharge this. It can only be recharged in very small areas that are exposed to the surface. And then your book also talks about, and you should know that the Colorado River, which is where there are over 20 dams, like 25 dams on the Colorado. No, actually, I think there are more like 40 dams on the Colorado River. It no longer reaches the ocean, the river. This is the river basin. So as you get close to the ocean, it's pretty much dried up, which is not good. And then specifically for California, we have been in a drought, or we were in a drought. It was actually declared over earlier this year, which is good. But we had 3 consecutive years of drought from 2007 to 2009. You could just see we had below average rainfall for these years. But maybe you remember last year was particularly wet, and we had over 100% of our average rainfall. And this is an interesting statistic too. It's current groundwater overdrafting, which means how much groundwater we take out. Kind of a net surplus. So we take out 2,200,000 acre-feet of groundwater a year, more than is replenished. Okay, so if this was zero overdrafting, that means, of course, we're taking out groundwater, but we would be taking it out at the same rate that it's replenished. Overdrafting is when you take out more than is replenished, and we're currently doing this at the rate, as you can see here, 2.2 million acre-feet a year, which is a lot. But our drought was declared over in March of this year, which is good, and hopefully it will keep that way, stay that way. And just a graph to show you these years of drought from 2007 to 2009. Not only the rainfall was low, but the reservoir storage was below average for those years too. So what can happen when too much groundwater is extracted? As I mentioned before, there's subsidence, which is essentially like a sinkhole where the water, because you can imagine under the ground, you have all this water, and if you pull too much out, the land is going to start to kind of collapse on top because you're losing a lot of that pressure underneath. So, and as maybe you remember in the movie Flow that I showed, this was happening a lot in areas of Michigan where they were pulling out too much groundwater. And there's also something called saltwater intrusion, which is, it happens in areas that are close to the ocean. And this happens a lot in California. And this shows two different scenarios here. This is kind of a normal scenario or a good scenario where you have a well and you're pumping out the water. And here you have the cone of depression, if you remember that. But if you're close to the ocean, at some point there is a barrier. So this is the ocean. This is water here. This is the shore. Okay, so this is, well, that's the shore, but this is sand that's underneath the ocean. And this is going to hold, it's going to also soak up water, and it's going to soak up the salt water from the ocean. And at some point you have this transition zone of the land. Again, this is land, but it's soaked with water. And at some point you're going to have this transition where you have this brackish zone, which means kind of salty and fresh water mixed. And then you get the fresh water here. Saltwater intrusion is when you pump so much water out of this fresh water that the pressure gets so low that the salt water from the ocean starts to go into the well, and it's the salt water is intruding, and you get salty water. And this is happening a lot in Southern California, actually, and it's a big problem. Their water is super salty. Okay, so what are ways to alleviate water problems? Water shortage problems. Something called desalinization, which means the removal of salt from ocean or brackish water. And considering that salt water is 97.5% of all of our water, this is good. At least it has potential, although it uses a lot of energy. And the two methods are distillation, which is when you evaporate salt water. Okay, so the water evaporates, becomes vapor, and then you can condense it again, and that would then be fresh water because the salt was left behind. And then there's also something called reverse osmosis, which forces salt through a membrane, salt water through a membrane, but it's only permeable to water and not to salt. So essentially you're filtering out the salt. And these two methods are very expensive. So places like Saudi Arabia are able to do it because they have a lot of energy and money. But it's not done too widely. And then there you can also conserve water, which is done a lot in agriculture, which is good because they use, over 80% of water. And traditionally this has been very inefficient. This use has been very inefficient. But there's something called micro-irrigation, which you can conserve water by piping it to crops through these sealed systems. Right here you can see this is a drip irrigation. So instead of spraying the whole landscape with sprinklers of water, where a lot of that water would evaporate, you drip the water directly onto the roots, and so less evaporates and you save more, which is good. And last, conserving water at home. So you can install water-saving shower heads and faucets, low-flush toilets, fix any leaks that you have high-efficiency appliances. Modify your personal habits like you did over Thanksgiving, hopefully. And using a dishwasher instead of washing by hand actually saves water too. And there's something called gray water, which is using kind of leftover water that you had, like whether it's from a shower, like if you put a bucket in your shower when you're taking a shower, and the bucket would get full of water that kind of came off the shower, you can use that to flush toilets or wash your car, water the lawn. And that's something that people do in areas that are very, very low in water. And actually folks in California had to do during the drought in the 80s. And you can see this often here is a storage tank where you can save this gray water and actually use it to water and flush the toilet, which would be good. All right, I am all out of time. Thanks for listening.